We are here today. I'm sitting on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of custodians of this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge their non-ceded custodianship. And I'm here to welcome Jane Hardwicke Collings, zooming in from
East Kangaloon, Gundungurra country.
Welcome, Jane. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to start with a short bio, just so that people who don't know you get an idea of your background and your work. So Jane Hardwicke Collings is a grandmother, former home birth midwife for 30 years, a teacher, writer, and menstrual educator. She gives workshops on mother and daughter preparation for menstruation, the spiritual practice of menstruation, and the sacred dimensions of pregnancy, birth, and menopause. Jane founded and runs the School of Shamanic Womancraft, an international women's mysteries school. And I need to mention that that's where I first met Jane. I was in your second year of the school, which is going back 10, 11 years, and did the Four Seasons journey, which was this amazing 1-year journey, which I'm sure Jane will talk about in a little while. But it was a lovely wake-up call for me that really connected me into my body and the earth and the seasons and the map and the women's mysteries. And it was just wonderful. And it's really informed my work and my life since. So big thank you to you, Jane. So the first question that we're asking our guests is, what do you think, what comes to mind or heart when you hear the term midlife, pleasure and power?
Well, firstly, like a yeehaw! And I feel the power. I certainly feel that. And many women say that's associated with having less fucks to give. And I feel a power in myself that's very different to how I felt power in myself before. So I think it's probably more grounded and more confident. So, that would align with the idea of having less fucks to give. It doesn't really concern me as much as it did what other people might think. I mean, I still do. I mean, that's human nature. That's how we stay safe. But I care less about that, and I'm more prepared to use my power in a way of, like, speaking my words of truth, etc. And then pleasure, well, the concept of pleasure is one of my biggest teachers through menopause, both sexually and every other kind of pleasure too. So menopause is teaching me to slow down and take and make space for pleasure. And that's a new concept for me. So that's what comes up when I think of midlife, pleasure and power. And also midlife, I think that's an important word to add to menopause. Like, it's not the end, it's midlife.
Nice. Thank you. And I'm glad that you talked about pleasure in other contexts as well, because we hear it and we tend to just think sexual, but it's sensual, isn't it? It involves all of the senses. And it might be the most delicious mouthful of food or the scent of a rose. And you've also sort of contextualized it in time as well. And to have the luxury and capacity for pleasure, we need to have time, don't we?
Mm, mm, mm.
Yeah. So would you give a sort of snapshot of your how you woke up to your teachings that you offer so many women across the world? Where did it all start for you?
Yeah, well, it started in my home birth midwifery practice, actually, where I was able to see that, contrary to what I'd been led to believe and taught as a midwife, that there was much more going on than the medically risky event of childbirth. And what I learned was what I now call the shamanic dimensions of pregnancy and birth, which is all that lay beneath, above, and around one's experience of oneself in the culture we live in has a massive impact on how we give birth. So I really learned it all pretty much as a midwife. And I basically started the school of shamanic womancraft when I was 50 years old. So retrospectively, that ended up being the beginning of my journey of perimenopause. And so my last period was when I was 56. So at 50, I started the school basically on the impulse of wanting to share what I'd learned, my harvest. So I didn't really know this at the time. So it's something that I can look back on. And basically I wanted to do at that time I wanted to do more than one-to-one birth work. I wanted to have a bigger effect. I wanted to reach more women. I wanted to share the wisdom of the cycles and more with as many people as who would listen. So what I'd learned as a home birth midwife was, as I said, the impact of so many things on a woman's birthing experience, especially her own birth, like how she was born, her menarche, her experience of her menstrual cycle and all her previous births, including other than human babies' births, because women, when we're in the summer or mother season of our lives, we are the creatrix and we conceive, gestate, and birth and need to nurture all manner of things besides human babies, if in fact that ever does happen. So careers or projects or businesses or gardens or next versions of ourselves, whatever. So I learned as a midwife that there was so much more going on, and that so as well as childhood trauma and red thread patterns, so red thread or motherline patterns. So learning all of this stuff as a midwife, I created a program, a year-long program, with some help from one of my teachers, Cedar Barstow in America, to help women understand who they are and why we do what we do the way we do it, and to reconnect with the wisdom of the cycles, our menstrual cycle, our rites of passage, do the healing work in circle in an earth honoring way. So connecting into the seasons and the lunar cycle, all the cycles. So that's basically how I got to do that, which was really, as I say, doing my bit to help with healing the wounded feminine and the wounded masculine of our patriarchal culture.
Mm. And I think it was actually with you that I really heard, because patriarchy now and patriarchal, those words are very prevalent everywhere. They're on the tip of everybody's tongue. But a decade ago, they were used a little bit, but not very much at all. It wasn't fully in our consciousness. So you were sort of riding the beginning of that wave of change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like I'd been on that road with birth for decades already, because helping women have babies out of the system is, I mean, that's still happening and very slowly, but yeah. So the school started in 2008 in my backyard on our property by the creek, and has grown over the past 13 years to be an international women's mystery school. And we've got just over 400 graduates or participants, and it's a teacher training process as well. So we've got about 13 teachers, and we've got currently 5 programs happening within Australia, and all our overseas programs are on hold at the moment because, we're not going anywhere, actually.
Yeah. So when you talk about birth and birthing outside of the system, that really invites a very different relationship with our bodies as women. And I'm thinking around trust and listening, and from what because I have my babies at home, and I remember a lot of well-meaning folk were like, really questioning my choices, and also whether the baby would live or I would live. There's the death card. Death is sort of the big one on top of those choices, sort of. But what I think, what I really want to ask is, how does our relationship with our body, and perhaps you can put it in your own context of your own perimenopause and menopause, how did that color your experience of perimenopause and menopause?
Oh, hugely. Yeah, so because one rite of passage, so the main rites of passage that we work with, the blood mysteries or the women's mysteries, so our own birth, our menarche or first period, and then every pregnancy results in a birth, even if it's a miscarriage, or we should be saying early pregnancy loss instead of miscarriage. It's a better frame for it. And all of that. So one rite of passage leads to the next. And if you learn the lesson from the rite of passage, then you advance in this kind of like life journey process of learning the next one and the next one. But if you don't, then you often have to have a repeat performance to get it. So for my experience of perimenopause, there's such a massive connection to my own birth and my menarche and every pregnancy I've had. Sometimes it's easy to see the connection, other times the pattern's a little bit broader, but yeah, so I think that that's part of the whole women's mysteries perspective, is that these rites of passage are not sort of isolated events. They are like our life journey unfolding. So my experience of perimenopause and menopause, well, it's 7 years now since my last period, and I'm still having hot flushes and lots of healing opportunities, especially sexually, as all my previous traumas arise. So as Dr. Christian Northrup says, menopause is the rite of passage designed to heal all the unhealed parts of you. So, 7 years on, I'm still, deep in the healing opportunities, which I don't think ever stops at any point in our lives anyway. But this menopause is kind of next level. And for me, I actually knew what to expect physically. I'd done all the research and I was teaching the theory, but I hadn't had my own experience yet. And that's a pattern for me, to learn all about something before it happens to me so I can feel as safe as possible. I became a midwife because I wanted to have a baby. I wanted to learn all about it. Like, what I learned completely messed with my head, but anyway, that's another story. But what I've learned about menopause is what menopause offers us as in transformation, not just the medical side of it, because it's not a disease process. It's a natural process, if it is natural. I mean, there can be other menopauses that happen, either surgically or chemically or rarely prematurely. But in the physiological menopause, the natural menopause, there's so much opportunity for transformation, and like as a midwife, I knew, so basically I knew what was going to happen, but I was completely surprised by my own personal transformation. Because as a midwife, I thought there couldn't be possibly anything more transformational than giving birth until I went through menopause. So physically, my experience was a couple of very heavy, clotty periods. I actually loved the sensation of that. That was an unusual experience for me, but it felt amazing having these big clots coming out of me. But, maybe that's a little bit too much information, but I found that actually pleasurable. And then the next thing that happened was increased time between periods, between bleeds. And then I had my last period, my last bleed, when my father died, which I'd already stopped for months and months. So it was kind of an unexpected one when he died. And that sometimes happens for women when major events happen in their lives, they bleed again. And then after that last period, 18 months later, I had another total ovulation and bleeding. Well, obviously 14 days later, I bled. And that was really amazing. I was actually reading Dr. Christian Northrup's little booklet called the Pleasure of Menopause, or the Secret Pleasures of Menopause. I can't remember. It's just a little book. Yeah, it's good. It's all about nitric acid and all good stuff. Anyway, I was in the Channel, in the train going from England to Paris, reading this book, and she's talking all about pleasure and blah, 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 and I ovulated, and I felt it, and I'm like, oh, because I hadn't ovulated for ages, because that's the thing that stops first in the perimenopausal journey. And so I thought, oh my God, was that an ovulation? If it was, then when I get back home to Australia, I will bleed. And sure enough, I did. So that was my second last period, which I think is really important because, there's this idea that menopause gets diagnosed, and that in itself, I think, is not the right terminology because it's not a disease and doesn't need diagnosis. But the idea being that you stop for a year and then, then you're done. But 18 months later, I had the whole thing happen again. So, and then through that time, I've had heaps of hot flushes and some insomnia, but that turned into just waking up every few hours and going back to sleep easy enough. It felt actually like newborn breastfeeding, like same sort of like, and the same trap there of counting how much sleep you've had,
Yeah.
which is like a doom loop, I reckon. Well, for me, so
Yeah, me too.
yeah.
Me too.
Yeah, but I actually was fine. Like, so the wakeful nights, once I could actually go back to sleep, that was all fine. And all of that really, truly is more about the workload that I put on my liver and the state of my adrenals. In other words, the amount of stress that I was under, or I was maintaining myself in, which was really what was normal for me. And that was really about the stress that I was feeling and maintaining was really about the childhood trauma that was in my body, that was taking the opportunity to be noticed, which is actually the same for everybody. That's nothing specific for me.
Yeah.
So another thing that happened for me quite unexpectedly was that I quit smoking. I was only having like one rollie a day, and I talked myself into thinking, oh, that doesn't matter. But then at one point during the menopausal journey, my menopausal self had harsh words with me saying, who do you think you're fooling? Only yourself. And so I stopped, and easily. And that was unexpected because I had no intention of stopping. I was enjoying sitting out on the veranda in the evening having a rollie. And
Yeah.
the other thing big thing that happened was that I started to face and deal with my high blood pressure, which I had been ignoring for a long, long time. And that's been a big journey in and of itself, because the transformation in around perimenopause and menopause is usually accompanied by a physical situation that's connected to a psychological and an emotional one. So that's how that all played out for me. The other thing the other thing was I'm sad about my decreased libido and painful sex, but I see that is more about how my childhood trauma is affecting my sexuality rather than menopause. Like menopause gets blamed for so many things, and it's unfairly, but because everything catches up with you at menopause. Like, as Dr. Christian Northrup says, everything that you've swept under the carpet comes out at menopause so that you can deal with it and not take it into the second half of your life. So that, before menopause, my sexuality was so much simpler. It was basically reproductively oriented. I didn't realize that until later, but that, and there was this animal lust, and I can tell that now because I don't have that now. And for me, and I know that this is the case for many women, not everyone, but for me, my sexuality is the front line for me now. It's where my traumatized self is showing up the most. So it's the place that calls on me most for my inner healing. And the other big thing is that my hot flushes, which I've been having for so long, 10 years of hot flushes, they're lessening now, probably because I'm listening now. So my hot flushes have taught me actually about my superpower of endurance, which came to me from my childhood trauma of enduring pain and other things. And my sisters would speak of the pleasurable hot flushes one particular sister who is dear to both of us, who is Aphrodite embodied, would say she called them hot blushes instead of hot flushes. And I'm listening to her, and I'm thinking, I found no pleasure in my hot flushes. They completely irritated me because I was enduring them. So there's no pleasure in enduring, holding on with gritted teeth and to a hot flush. But I have learned that the pleasure, actually even bliss, comes from responding to the hot flush rather than enduring it. So actually the simple act of ripping off my jumpers and getting cool brings me physical pleasure. So this is actually quite recent and came to me in some deep sacred circle space at a recent dark moon gathering in the Four Seasons journey that I was co-teaching up in Byron Bay. Like this, the dark goddess spoke to me, as she does, and I really got this whole teaching about how I don't actually have to endure everything. I can do other things besides endure. So I'm extremely grateful for that teaching.
Mm. As you're talking, I'm wondering, because I like you, I like to know what's happening and study and get sort of, yeah, get the lowdown on everything, so I'm prepared. And I'm still perimenopausal, but towards the end, I know I'm at the end of my perimenopause journey, but I've been framing it for myself and others like it's like a bridge, that perimenopause is like this bridge, and there are physical challenges, as the hormones and all of the emotions and the history and all of that shedding has to be done. But then when you're in menopause, I'm not there yet. You've been there a few years. What would you say is the difference between them?
Oh, well, as I said, there's still a lot of transformational opportunities, and like you don't just tick the box when you've healed something. It's layer upon layer upon layer. And I think the difference between perimenopause on the bridge to getting to the other side is that, some years after your last period and it doesn't look like it's coming back, there's sort of a sense, well, I had the sense of, okay, well, if I have a map, now I know where I am. So I think perimenopause is like this, like, where the fuck am I? What is going on? Who am I? Like, that's the big thing, because we can't even know who we are. We don't recognize ourselves because we've never operated on that particular cocktail of hormones before in our lives. So we can't know who we're going to be or who we're going to fit, what we're going to feel like. So on the other side,
Yeah.
there is some sort of like, oh, okay, or maybe I'm here, wherever here is, but unknown territory.
So it's not the same, because I remember reading somewhere it's like our hormones sort of go the same as the pre-first period, pre-puberty, that there's a similarity, but maybe it's a different cocktail of hormones. But that feisty pre-pubescent girl comes out and is sort of the friend of the menopausal woman.
Absolutely, yeah. But there's also the added increased luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone
Of
that
course, they're raised, aren't
they
they?
raise and stay at the levels that they are at ovulation when you have a menstrual cycle. So
And they've been linked to intuition, right?
that's right.
And
That's
and
what, and visionary capacity.
and earlier you talked about your menopausal voice. Do you think they're sort of related?
Oh,
Like,
definitely.
because I definitely get whispers of that menopause voice, but
Yeah.
and then sometimes I listen and sometimes I don't, but it tends to be intuitively guided.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm blown away often by the things I know that I didn't think I knew, intuitively, and the visionary capacity. Like it's huge. But the other thing about on the other side of the bridge is that when everything sort of settles down, we're more stable. We don't have such ups and downs like the peak of ovulation and the depths of the bleeding phase. That doesn't happen anymore. So it's instead of like this, and that's not good or bad, it's just that's what it is. It's more like this. And so without those huge fluctuations, there's more energy, physical energy available, and 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 more kind of ability to be present with what is rather than being overwhelmed by what your body's doing in a cycle, say. And the biggest piece is that it's about the veil of estrogen. So at menarche, and this is when we depart from that feisty pre-menarche girl who is, as you said, like a great ally or familiar sense to us when we're post-menopause, but we're so much cleverer than her now,
Yeah.
and aware of what's happened to us and the effects of us. Like, probably in the pre-menarche girl, let's say usual age is 13, so in pre-teen, she's probably deep in whatever drama her family's going through and all the stuff at school and all the weird changes happening to her body that she's not really sure what's going on. So there's lots of similarity. And then there's this veil of estrogen that descends upon us and stays with us for the 40 years or so of our menstrual cycle. And estrogen is known as the hormone of accommodation and the hormone of sacrifice. So that means that we will sacrifice our own whatever to nurture our children or our career or whatever it is that we need to nurture, and we will do without so that that can do with, say. And we're richly rewarded for it. It feels good. We like that we are able to, feed our children or open the shop or whatever it is that we do. But then with perimenopause, the thing that happens is this veil of estrogen begins to rise. And it gets to here. And the most uttered words are, how come I'm the only one who does anything around here? Or such likeness. And, like it's the time, it's the wake-up call, as Dr. Christian Northrup says. It's the time when you no longer you're no longer kind of physiologically driven to look after everybody else anymore. So you start to notice, firstly, how much you haven't probably been looking after yourself, but also how many people in a family situation, whether it's partners or teenage children, or depending on when you had your children, of course, that are really dependent on you and how much you have made that happen. Like, in a good way, but it's quite a shock for everybody else when, this veil of estrogen rises and the woman's going like, hang on, things have got to change around here. And they're like, well, it was okay yesterday. Well, it's not okay today. You've changed. Yes, I've changed. So on the other side will be different, but the same, because, wherever you go, there you are. But there's a freedom from that kind of sacrificial way of being, of putting others first. For good, like in a good way, not in a bad way. I mean, good way depends how your maidenhood was, of course. Like if a woman had to, if a girl had to grow up, in inverted commas, and be the mother of the family when she was 10 because her mother was, something else was happening, then whatever happens in the spring of our lives, so to speak, continues to grow and shows up in all of these kind of normal processes that, so if, the way that might show up for somebody who didn't really have a carefree childhood would be that the rest of their lives they'd be thinking like, well, what about me? When do I get my turn? Or when is my time? Or whatever, So that's kind of like the pathology that stays with us if we have a, what would be the word? That's the other thing. Memory.
Yeah.
The the best word, the favorite word, the most used word in the perimenopausal and postmenopausal journey I've noticed is thing. You know, because thing can mean so many things, and you just got to watch you don't fill a sentence with thing. There has to be
Okay.
not
Yeah.
too many things. But yeah, so I'm raving a bit now. Sorry about that.
No, no, it's good. Because it's making me think, like you mentioned spring and the seasons, and so autumn is our post-menopausal season and the harvest and perimenopause, we're certainly stepping into autumn. And that's something that I really appreciated learning about, that because traditionally it's maiden, mother, crone. It's the three. You sort of jump from being a mother into being a crone. So there's this magnificent season. You call it Queen, Autumn Queen, and it's a sort of a celebration of life, a harvest of your life that's gone before, and seeding new projects or new work for the community. So not in this estrogen sense that you were talking about before, but perhaps more in a soul purposeful way.
Mm. Well, like with a mission.
So if the School of Shamanic Womancraft was your perimenopausal offering, what's your mission now you're fully in?
Yeah, good question. Well, more of
Or
the
is it
same.
a deepening?
Yeah,
Yeah,
more of the same.
more of the same.
Yeah,
And where does elder, when do we become an elder?
yeah.
Like where,
Oh,
like because it's sort of like, for me, winter, and this is the way I've framed it for myself, and you may have a different framing, but for me winter is really about the preparation of going in, like fully in, and preparing for for your death. Because that's the other thing I've noticed with perimenopause, is like that sense of my own mortality is so much closer, so much more in my face, and it's like I don't have as much time as I had. Everything has to count. Relationships, like some fall away because they don't sort of feel that, just have the same, I don't know. I think I'm more precious with my time and more
mm,
conscious of how I spend it. So that was a bit of a ramble for me, but I think the main question is, yeah, where does elder fit
mm,
in, and where does winter and autumn? Yeah,
yeah,
because that's still questions.
yeah. Well, I think like there can be a couple of different ways we might look at elder, and like in our kind of family, whoever's the oldest is the elder. So that could be like you could be in your mother's season and your mother's died and then you're the matriarch then. So in a way you are the elder of your family, but in the way that I think you mean it, the wisdom keeper and the leader and the the person who's had some experience enough to know that this is what happens if blah and blah and blah, and who has some leadership sort of um, impulses and qualities. I think it starts with the Marga phase, with the autumn, so post menopause. So once we get through the over the bridge, and things, we get a bit of a handle on our transformational work and healing that we need to do. That's when we be an elder. So like the grandmother, whether you're a grandmother actually or not, I think that's my answer to that. That it's that, and I hear that too. Like I've got, I spend quite a lot of, well, I talk a lot on social media and a lot of sharing the wisdom that I have gained or learned, and a lot of younger women in their 20s and early 30s say things like, thank you for being our elder. So, there it is. I think it's like the postmenopausal woman who has the time and the energy to bother to give back and give back her harvest. So hence the autumn. So the maiden mother crone thing, so that's an old story, as you said. But now, like menopause average age of normal natural menopause is 50. So that's like midlife, as we were saying before. So it's not the winter time, as you said, the going within. It's more like the harvest time. It's like autumn. It's where we have to do like the deciduous trees and just let go of what was once a vital green leaf, for example, turns in color, looks very beautiful, and then crumples up and falls to the ground. So, like, because our culture is so fixated on youth and beauty, then the perimenopausal woman can be really confronted by the aging process in a negative way, because that's how our culture sees it. But it's the time of harvest when we actually must give back what we've learned to help everybody else. And I don't love it. I'm very annoyed actually by the fact that evolutionary biologists have asked the question, why would a human woman live beyond her fertility? What is the possible use of her? And so they cleverly turned to nature for their answer, and they found that there are 5 creatures on the planet that go through menopause. So us, and then the other 4 live in the ocean, and they're the toothed whales, the pilot whale, the orca or killer whale, the beluga whale, and the narwhal, the unicorn of the sea. And what they learned from observing these post-reproductive grandmother whales, what they saw was that their role in their pod was that they were the leaders. And their very presence ensured that their sons and daughters lived longer and that their grandchildren thrived. So that, I think, is the most wonderful reframe for the role of the postmenopausal woman, is to be a leader of the pod. And imagine what would happen if that was the case. And the other thing I love to remember is the traditional Chinese medicine perspective of menopause. Like, it's not a disease process or a hormonal imbalance. It's called the second spring. And the lovely thing about that is that the seeds that sprout in that second spring are the seeds of the fruit that were the fruit of the seed, which was the beginning of us. So it's like the second spring becomes our offering, what comes from us. So then I think we go into the crone years at around 70 or so, when we're in the winter, and it's just a different story.
Yeah. It brings to mind a beautiful quote that I can't remember it word for word, but about the second spring, and it's thousands of years old, this quote, and it's about the energy rising from the womb to the heart. And I really like that as well, that it's more of a heart sense rather than a womb sense of that kind of creation, I guess.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, you mentioned Cedar Barstow, who I've never met, but she has written a whole book about power, hasn't she? Can you talk a little bit about, because all I remember is from her work is she talks a lot about power with rather than power over or power under. What's been your main learning around power? Maybe not from her work, just generally.
Yeah. So CEDA has actually got an institute. It's called the Right Use of Power Institute, which, the right use of power is actually the thing that we're dealing with in our culture right here, right now. Like we're seeing the abuse of power, not the right use of power. So the way CEDA describes it is that everything is about power in relationship, and you are either in a power up role or a power down role. And that your position needs to be taken into account, because that defines the relationship. And it's when a person is in a power up role is always in a power up role with the person that's in a down power role, and that therefore there's the potential for the abuse of power.
Okay.
Right? So like, for example, like the classic example would be in a, say, doctor and patient relationship. The doctor is always the power up in that situation, and the patient is always the power down, and that defines the relationship and creates boundaries. And when those boundaries get blurred or walked over, it's a misuse of power. So that's basically the fundamental thing about that. Now, in terms of where that fits with menopause, like in our culture, women are in the men are in the up power and women are in the down power role. Like whether we like it or not, I mean, it's changing, and in some situations it's the opposite. But generally speaking, in a patriarchal culture, that's the way it works. The suppression of the feminine, the oppression of women, the misogynistic perspectives that are woven through everything. So when when a woman goes through menopause, there's a shift in her own power. We talked about that at the beginning, so there's is that it brings her situation brings power into question, where she, like apparently 40 to 60% of divorces happen at menopause initiated by women. So there's a little bit of an indicator about like a wake up to like, what am I doing, in this power thing.
Yeah.
The other thing that I've learned about power in Dr. Christian Northrup's book, The Wisdom of Menopause, which is a fabulous book, and it really unravels this kind of medical perspective on menopause and sees it as a normal physiological thing in the same way that we would see childbirth as a normal physiological thing as opposed to a medical emergency, and menarche as a normal physiological thing rather than, I don't know what else you'd see that as. But she says that before menopause, we're like conducting on AC power, where we're getting the power from outside, and then post-menopause it's DC, so like a battery, like it's the power is within. So I think that's a nice way to frame it, like that. We're not actually needing to get power from outside; it's fully in, which makes sense too, because there's that lovely Native American saying of that at menarche a girl meets her power, through menstruation she practices her power, and at menopause she becomes her power.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
So I mean, like basically it's all about power. Everything is all about power.
Yeah. So where does that leave those 50? Because I remember reading like a lot of homeless people are actually women in their 50s.
I know, how tragic is it? That's the most increasing demographic of homelessness is postmenopausal women.
Yeah. So what's that about?
Well, that's because they don't have superannuation, because they haven't, had the opportunity probably to be sticking at a job that builds up some bank account that they can access later, or they've separated in their primary relationships so they don't have a home anymore. And like what it's about, I think, is a tragedy of the culture, and it's kind of like the next level of how damaging the nuclear family is. Like we know the nuclear family is like ridiculous in terms of how it works, actually doesn't work in terms of child rearing. And then the postmenopausal woman or the aging woman in her homelessness, like it's kind of like no one cares, and that sucks. So that's the wounded version, I see it as, which is also the other part is also the what they call it, the empty nest syndrome. So that once you've children have grown up and that was your purpose, then you have no purpose anymore, and you have this empty nest syndrome where you feel purposeless. And so that's all the pathology playing out
Yeah.
in lifestyles. So yeah, I have this vision with some other sisters of creating freestanding birthing sanctuaries where we also offer the homeless menopausal women a home, so they can come and tend the gardens that will produce the food that will feed the birthing families. So I hope
That's
other
a
people are
beautiful
thinking
vision.
about that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's much more community minded and living, isn't it? Working together.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Who would you say have been the inspiring men of I used to love the word MAGA until Donald Trump
I
started
know.
talking about make America great and again, and then it just
Lost it.
took. So we need another word for the menopausal woman.
Well, there's lots. Some people say enchantress
Uh-huh.
or seductress or um, Amazon, queen, as we mentioned
Yeah.
before, matriarch, grandmother, witch. I like boss witch. I reckon boss witch.
All right. So, who have been some shining boss witches for you in your life when you were younger? That you, because I think it's lovely to be able to have our role models ahead of
Mm,
us. Who
mm.
comes to mind for you that
Well,
you?
yeah, who I looked up to. Not
Mm,
a lot, actually. Like, not a lot, to be fair. So I think authors who were leading the way with their books and stuff, like, there's quite a few. Cedar, who we've talked about. So she's about 10 or 15 years older than me, and
yeah.
she taught me a bit about that. Like, and also my one of my own midwives, and who I did my midwifery apprenticeship with, Maggie Lecky Thompson. She's been somebody who I've kind of seen. Like you have your eye on someone who's older than you, watching,
Yeah.
how they're going. So yeah, so a few, but not many, because
Mm,
um, like, not that much older than me was the whole, like, full promotion of HRT, hormone replacement therapy, and you know lots of women were just avoiding menopause, the physical experiences of it. I think we need to not say symptoms, because that implies it's a disease, right? But the physical experiences of menopause by, taking hormones to override it. So that was a dominant experience, and still is. And like, when women need that help, that's great. But to have it just handed out, oh, this is what you do, is, to my mind, avoiding the healing transformational opportunities that the decreasing levels of hormones that are happening on purpose offer us. So I think that our culture has encouraged us to avoid pain, avoid discomfort, stay forever young. I mean, everyone's trying to look like a 25-year-old. In fact, I would love to just share at this moment some indigenous wisdom that was shared with me by Min Maya, who's one of our awesome um, allies in this work, and a Wiradjuri law, LAW and LORE woman. And when I had the opportunity to sit at her feet and ask her questions and write as fast as she was talking, I asked her, "What about menopause? Like, what's your perspective on that?" And she said, "Ah, I don't know any woman, Koori or white, who's ready for the honour of that change of transformation. Everybody's trying to be a cougar and look young." She said, and I said to her, "So what we read is that menopause is a time when we need to renegotiate things, renegotiate our relationships, our our relationship with food and work and exercise and all that, renegotiating so that we can, adapt and get on with it." And she just laughed her head off and said, "Renegotiation is such a Western way of thinking. It is not about renegotiating." She said, "The role of the Mimi," which is her name for the postmenopausal woman, "is not about renegotiation and then business as usual. It's nothing like that. It's a whole new role." She said, "The role of the Mimi, the postmenopausal woman, is to weave the dreams for the grandchildren."
that's beautiful.
So I think what we're trying to do as a culture is get through so that we can just get back to where we were. And that doesn't happen. It can't happen. Unless, well, actually, it can happen. Hormone replacement therapy helps you stay in the same way that the pill puts you in a limbo situation, so too does HRT.
Right. So, what dreams are you weaving for your hour?
Grandchildren.
Yeah, for the
For our well,
yeah.
I want to do what I can so that when I'm asked by my great grandchild, "Grandma, what did you do when there was that time back then when things had to be done or else? What did you do? So I want to be able to proudly say I did blah 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 and blah. So basically what I mean by that, how I'm weaving the dreams for the grandchildren is that I'm doing whatever I can to make sure in the ways that I can that the world, and not just the world, the culture that our grandchildren are inheriting from us is something that we can, at least be as proud as possible that we did what we could to make it as good as we can. Like, I don't know if that's even possible anymore, but what I'm doing is focusing on rites of passage
Yeah.
and making sure that the transformational journey that we have in our rites of passage is positive, not negative. So
Mm.
healing, not rewounding. And I feel especially that birth is the important one because birth creates the future. And the way birth is conducted in the system is not thinking like that. And
Yeah.
my thoughts with what we can do around birth is whatever we can do to make sure that attachment happens, secure attachment happens between the mother and the baby for the baby's sake, because when a baby is securely attached to the mother, then it has resilience, and then it can
Mm.
handle things much easier than someone who doesn't have resilience because they had a birth experience that took that away, that opportunity, that beginning away from them in developing resilience. And all we have to do, I mean, there's lots we have to do, but not everybody's going to end up having a home birth or a free birth, so most people will still birth within the system. So a big part of my work is focusing on that and doing what needs to be done to help the birth workers at the front line be most especially aware that how they act is affecting the mother and the experience. And so just the simple request for every birth worker to bring gentleness and kindness to mothers and babies so that
Mm.
attachment happens in the way that it can, and that baby has as much resilience as possible so it can handle the future that we really have no idea what it's going to be like. But the
Yeah.
more resilient you are, the better. So that's what I'm doing.
Mm. I know there's heaps of psychological studies and research around attachment, and it's becoming a lot more known of how important it is. But I'm not sure that how many of them start with birth. It's more sort of after birth. Like I'm sure I don't be heaps and heaps of it, but I just haven't heard a lot of it starting there. Yeah.
It's true. And clearly it starts at birth. Whatever happens at the beginning of something, including your life, sets the energy for what will unfold. And, birth trauma, which sadly is 1 in 3 women,
Mm.
is not having a
Yeah.
resilient baby or mother. It's having a traumatized mother and baby who will be able to handle stress less.
Yeah. Mm.
And I think that that's the big question, for postmenopausal women. You got to get over that bridge, as you said, but then on the other side, it's like, okay, now what are you going to do? It's your responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, how are you going to rest? Because that is the it's sort of dual, isn't it? It's what are you going to do? But it's important to because I feel that desire. It's dual, and there's a tension there if I don't listen to both. So when I need to rest, I rest because it's sort of like there is that kind of just desire to go and be in the woods in a cabin and or grow food and not kind of like and maybe that's also at the times that we're in but not be too sort of out in the world.
Hmm.
So it's yeah, I feel
Yeah,
that as a dual kind of, and our bodies tell us, don't they, when we need to rest.
absolutely. And also, like autumn, part of the teachings of autumn, that life phase, is about the balance of light and dark, like equal balance, light and dark, the autumn equinox, which is right in the middle of menopause or
Mm,
postmenopause.
that's nice. I like that. So you could frame it like that, couldn't you, of equal rest and equal action.
Yeah, I reckon. And that's what the earth does, so she's our greatest teacher.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we are all as if the earth.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, for our final question, what pearls of wisdom would you leave women at midlife about this time? What would you, if there was one thing? I mean, you've obviously given so much, so thank you for your time and wisdom today and this chat. But what would you like to say around?
Well, I want to just say one thing that's not necessarily a pearl of wisdom, but a important thing that not very many people know, and that is that hot flushes, which are one of the most common physical experiences of menopause, that prior to a hot flush, we have a hit of adrenaline happen in our bodies. It's kind of like the aura for a hot flush, in the same way that somebody who has epileptic fits knows that they're going to have a fit, or somebody who has a migraine sometimes gets the feeling that the migraine's
Mm,
coming. So for a hot flush, there is this bang of adrenaline, and then the hot flush comes. But not enough people know this, and so what they think is happening is that they're getting anxiety, or that they're fearful or anxious, because the bang of adrenaline makes you think, oh, something's wrong, or something's going to happen, or where are my children, or I'm about to die, or wherever you go with a bit hit of adrenaline.
yeah.
And then the hot flush happens, and it's like, oh, it was the aura for the hot flush. So because a lot of women get diagnosed with anxiety at menopause, and I bet it is that. So
Mm,
that's really important. And I guess the pearl of wisdom, or um, the invitation I would I would like to leave and offer is this idea of Min Myers, that it's a new role, and the role is not business as usual, and the role of the grandmother, whether you're a grandmother or not, is to take some responsibility and co-create, co-weave whatever the grandchildren are going to need.
mm,
So it's in the way, it's not about yourself anymore. It's about looking after the others in a way that's different to mother, but in a way that is more of a holding as opposed to a doing. So I would just say, please take the opportunity to be an elder, and let's usher in a future for our grandchildren and great grandchildren that we can have some pride in
yeah.
having helped co-create.
Thank you, Jane. Mm.
Thank you,
And
Charlotte.
well, as you speak, I'm thinking it's more of a holding in a community sense rather than in the nuclear family sense, or in the shop or business or whatever sense. It's more of a stepping back and doing and perhaps even if it's energetic, like it doesn't have to be out on the front line. I mean,
Mm.
for some it is, for some it totally is, but for others it could be their version of praying, or like, but it's that consciousness, isn't it, of
Yes,
the bigger, the
yes.
all.
Weaving the spells in the background.
So where can people find you when if they want to see more of your work? Where should they look?
Well, I have a website, janehardwickcollings.com, and there's lots of things on there that I've written, and I've got a little shop on there. I've got an e-course called Autumn Woman Harvest Queen, about harnessing the powers of menopause, and trying to figure out what is going on. So there's that. And the School of Shamanic Womancraft has its own website too, schoolofshamanicwomancraft.com. So, and I'm on social media, Instagram and Facebook, with, dropping some provocative statements every so often.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. Good to see you.
Yeah, lovely to see you, Charlotte, and good on you for doing this, and thank you on behalf of everybody.
Thanks, Jane.